In this video, I'm philosophizing on personality characteristics, meaningful to infer certain existing processes and or existing properties constituted from existing intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, not non-existing intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties one may think exists and or think is relevant to certain meaningful utterances of thought within the deliberations and or judging as to what constitutes a meaningful personality characteristic. Be it that personality characteristics derive from uniquely persona and or self-preferences, meaning that one whom is engaging in certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties related to one's subjectivity, internalizing the introspections of a distinct, unique voice within one's introspective processes, engaging introspections within the meaningful utterances of thought, vocalizing internally a certain tone and or pitch and or cadence to one's temporaneous, fleeting, ephemeral characterizing of how one feels with inferences into certain underlying contemporaneous values and or inferable patterns of conducts and or intrinsic motivations to that voice, that internal voice, distinct from how the self may experientially encounter one's own being within subsequent moments or the next day, with distinct streams of consciousness connecting the persona of the individual to the conductions within mind-body connections, more meaningful to the self, whom is engaging direct perceptions. Yet it's important to distinguish the self from the persona, as the self is not the persona. The self is meaningfully more consistent across the distinct internal and or external conditions and or situations, meaning that the persona is more contemporaneous in comparison to the self, more consistent and or meaningful to cultivate meaningful living. Yet, as one engages exploration into the unknown unknowns, the persona is more meaningful for allowing the self to cultivate one's emotional intelligence in relation to the explorations engaging the plasticity of the persona, meaning that the persona is more like a mind's muscle, and more so the mind's extensor muscle to extend the self into new probabilistic possibilities, connecting one to certain self-preferences and or explorations of those self-preferences, more intrinsic to the self, not the persona, more dynamical and or fluid, as to mean that the persona may change from the next experiential, momentarily encountered experience one has within the experiential encounters with one's being, to transform that inner voice, perhaps from one volitionally engaging in a distinct set of meaningful information processing with relation to the aesthetic absorptions one ebbs and flows in and out of, meaning that one may be engaging in daydreaming within one momentary experiential encounter with the self, and then yet the next think to cook a meal. And within the thinking of cooking a meal, not necessarily engaging the conducts to go cook the meal, yet thinking that, well, I have an underlying deprivation within my psychological needs for meaning in life to cook a tasty meal. And yesterday I cooked a tasty meal, and that tasty meal had some bell peppers in it with distinct colors, and colors that I think were tasty, ironically. And that sounds weird, I know, but I really liked the way I put that meal together within the ways of my thought. And so you go and you cook a delicious meal from distinct pigments you perceive in distinct, creatively connected as to work, flavor profiles from existing priors. You're cooking a meal to cater to your self-preferences, engaging openness to exploration and or the characteristics of aesthetic feelings and or aesthetic appreciation for certain characteristics and or qualities. You may have engaged savoring to expand the meaningfulness processes within your direct perception, connected to optimizing subjective well-being within distinct momentary encounters. And also, be it that one has invested the time and or energy, engages the learning of nutritional information. One is engaging the consumption of information within to engage the proper associated duty of care to engage self-caring conducts, more likely to allowance meaningful health outcomes, engaging more self-disciplining within the time one has invested to engage the duty of care appropriate to engage self-care and or self-disciplining. By the way, self-disciplining being a form of self-care, engaging in more difficult and or consistent conducts to optimize those consistent conducts and or healthy psychological functioning. You do not discipline yourself to hurt yourself. You do not discipline yourself to cause harm and or engage self-inflicted harm. Self-discipline is not self-harm. Self-discipline is self-care. It optimizes one's subjective well-being, compared to perhaps engaging in the work ethic, more honest and or sincere to, within one's meaningful communications, clarify one's honest self-preferences, not the self-preferences one infers from what another says one likes. Instead, the self-preferences one has originated and one knows, one holds the existing self-knowledge and or self-awareness one likes, to be more honester in one's conducts and or to engage the fairest conducts one may in relation to more sincere directions of desired meaningful effect, to allowance the optimal truthful outcomes in relation to considerations of uniquely what one holds self-knowledge and or self-awareness to be true. Not what one thinks may be true directly from the result of another's communications, and yet knows one does not know quite what one thinks one knows, lacking the self-knowledge and or self-awareness without more appropriately calibrating one's self-knowledge and or self-awareness to the navigations of more appropriate conducts within one's persona, engaging that internal voice and or consolidating that with the deliberations one engages within the self, to think, perhaps maybe this is just how I feel right now, and not necessarily what I truly prefer. Thinking instead more deeply about one's existing self-knowledge and or self-preferences in relation to satisfying certain underlying psychological needs, to alleviate the deprivations within those needs, and engage more positive, meaningful emotions, satisfying certain underlying psychological needs of the self, meaningful to one's own experience of positive, meaningful emotions, more likely to be elicited within the probabilistic conducts one may conduct to satisfy certain underlying psychological needs for meaning in life. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one, keeping those episodes.